Hello and welcome to today's episode of this series on foundations, and I hope that you've been encouraged and you're not only finding it helpful, but I hope that it's stimulating questions in your own mind. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you to go ahead and leave comments on this if you're watching it on YouTube, or send me an email, or if you're listening to this on the podcast, make sure you jump over onto our website and send us a message if you've got any questions. And I know that yesterday and the day before it might have raised some questions, because as I've demonstrated and discussed the doctrine of light being Christ and the representation of God in the world, it's also the representation of Him as His goodness. Like everything that Jesus did was good. It says that He went about doing good. And so Jesus and God has always been defined as good, and it's His glory that is good. And then that raises questions, because we get to verse 5, which we're going to be looking at today as we look further into this doctrine of day and night. And the question comes, well then, was he really talking about Jesus and the glory of God, as some people might say? Because doesn't the next verse just say it was just day and it was just night? The sun's up in the day, the moon's up at night. Well, as we read, and I want to bring this out, that yes, like what I said about in one of the previous verses, that was it an epoch of time or was it a literal day? Whenever there is question about it, God always answers and clarifies through the word. We must always come to the Bible and let the Bible be the interpretation of that. So in essence, we read in Daniel that he interpreted Daniel's confusion. And so we're going to go to the Apostle Paul today. Like I said, that when we looked at the light, we went to what John was saying about the light. We went to what James was saying about the light. We looked at these different aspects to give clarity to what is the light. And today I want to continue doing that as we look at verse 5, where it says, "And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day." Now, this is what happened in the first day. That God just set the foundation. The first day was just getting everything ready. And all we actually have is God and His expression of Himself. See, because it says that the earth was without form. So we go, so the earth existed. Well, no, because it didn't have any form. Okay, so it's more like He's trying to say that, and what we know right now was actually not there. There was just nothing. It's like God was about to do something, but before He even did anything, He hovered over what He was about to do. He let light shine to what He was about to do, because without God, there's nothing. And so now we get into, yes, by the end of the first day, we still have something that is without form. It's just void. It's just blank. It's just empty. There is emptiness there. There is darkness there. And the very first thing that God did was sent light. Now, yes, He defines it as day and night, but as we discussed and as we'll look further, the sun and the moon are not created until later time period. And so this is where we must look, remembering that first mention, that law of first mention. And here, yes, we have that He defines, and this is where I would say this is a metaphorical aspect that God has brought out here, that He defines light as day, and He defines night as darkness. And this is continued throughout all of Scripture. And I want to take you now to 1 Thessalonians, and we're going to look in 1 Thessalonians at chapter 5 as Paul is speaking to the church in Thessalonica. And he says in verse 1, "But of the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you." Now, he's not saying because you already know what winter and summer and autumn and spring are. Here where he talks about seasons, he's talking about periods of time. He's talking about that the times and the seasons of, are we in the church age or are we in the end times? You don't need me to write unto you. Why? Because in verse 2 he says, "For yourselves know perfectly." Don't let anyone fool you, because you already know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. Now see that he's referencing here, when does a thief, now a thief is evil, a thief does things that are not good. God is not a thief, okay? When does a thief operate? In the night. He says, you know that the thief comes in the night. "For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness." Okay, now I want you to constantly be keeping one eye on the New Testament here and one eye on Genesis chapter 5, or 3 through to 5, where it's talking about light and day and night and darkness and light. "You, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day should overtake you as a thief. You are all the children of light and the children of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. And so what I want to demonstrate here is how that day and night is metaphorically used. It is physically used because we know that we sleep at night. There is such a thing as night and there is such a thing as day. And God did create a day and night. But in this context here, whilst yes, he created a literal day and a literal night, we also see that as God calls light day and darkness night, what he's actually doing is saying you will have a physical day and a physical night. But so that you understand my nature, so that you understand that, I'm also going to, throughout the scriptures, reference good as day. And I'm going to reference evil and darkness as night, because they embody each other. So we can look at this that yes, God did create a physical day and night, but his representation of light, he chose daytime to represent light. Everything that can be seen is in the day. Everything that is good is in the day. Everything that happens in visible broad daylight. And that's what he's saying. I express myself. He said it in Romans chapter 1, that people would be without excuse because he made himself known. He showed himself in the day. And in the night, it's darkness. There's an absence. Now, does that mean God's not there at nighttime? Of course not. He is there at nighttime. But he's using it as an expression, just as Paul used it later on, that we are not children of the night or of darkness. Does that mean Christians don't exist at nighttime? No, it doesn't mean that we don't exist, nor does it mean that we're not sometimes awake with our lights on. It doesn't mean that we get up or don't get up. But what he's referencing is the disparity and contrasting, as darkness represents evil, light represents good. And so I want you to see that this verse in verse 5 creates the foundation of, yes, a literal time period, because he said, and God called the light day and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And here God specifically defines that it's not an epoch of time. It is an epoch of time. It's one day. It's not 1,000 years. He created a morning and an evening. He created a day and a night. He created a singular time period, and it's what he uses for the rest of the following verses. So like I said, we must start with the beginning, and what God calls it is what it is. And so we must recognize that God is light, and all that is in the darkness is evil. And then God also called it day and night, and it was the first day. And this also gives us that understanding that there is a literal 6 days of creation, because he said there was a literal 6 days of creation. And we must always say, science said this, but God said this. And when science says this, we must recognize that science is actually the word for knowledge. And if knowledge does not come from God, then it's not really even knowledge at all. And that's why Paul calls it science so called, because they're calling it science, but it's not even really science. It's just a way that man tries to create without God, or try to excuse God away, or try and make up another reason for there to not be a God. But in the beginning, we always come back to this fact that God just is. And so I want to encourage you with that, and I want to bless you. That might have been a little bit confusing, but I want you to see that this has a dual purpose and a dual meaning. That God referenced the light that was good, his glory that was good, but then he called the daytime period good. Now, it doesn't mean that the nighttime is bad, but more he's using this now as a reference for the rest of the scriptures. He's creating a precedent here to say that I'm going to use darkness and nighttime to define evil throughout the scriptures, in prophetic teaching, in parable teaching, and just in common understanding when we say it's dark, it's evil, it's of the night. And I'm going to use light, my glory, my expression of myself, to reference the day and say this is when this happens, when it's all visible. And so remember that light will always represent God's glory, and the day represents God's glory being manifested in the earth. And so that will conclude this teaching here on good and evil, day and night, light and darkness, that it's all the representation of God's glory, and darkness, night, evil is not necessarily in itself thing, but rather the absence of God and his light and his glory. So I hope that helps clarify and not just create more questions, but I do encourage you to reach out and we'd have a chat about it, because this is so... Some people go, why is this important? The reason it's important is because we can't have good without God. We can't have moral judgment without God. We can't create something that is beneficial, because beneficial is good. And we can't have beneficial without God. We can't make a law that will serve without God, because it will be based on evil if it's not based on God. And God defines what is good. And if we can't start with that, then as we look through the Bible, it casts question and doubt over everything else he says. And that's why this is so important, that you understand that God is good. God is light, and all that comes from God, everything that is written, is something that we can hang our hat on. We can take it to the bank, whatever expression you want to use. We can build our life on this foundation. So be blessed. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and make sure that if you haven't subscribed yet, you go ahead and do that, so that you can get the next one that comes out as we look at what did God create and how does God define what he created. God bless.